Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Cyber Straight Talk with myself, Linda Zecker, and my co-host, Catherine Mihalik. So today, we're going to focus a conversation around the number one concern for companies, government agencies, and education institutions, cybersecurity. With us today is my friend Admiral Mike Hewitt, retired, who is founder and CEO of IP3. So, Mike, thank you so much for being here. Before we jump in, would you mind taking a minute to share with our audience a bit about your background and what you've been up to with IP3?
Thanks for having me, guys. 31 years in the U.S. Navy as an aviator. I did find myself spending 6 of my last 8 years in the Joint Chiefs in the J3, the Operations Directorate, in the early to mid 2000s. And my association with cyber started there, where I was handed the first responsibility for putting together the first Title 10 military use of cyber in support of the War on Terror. And of course, that process was very complex because we had no rules of the road. We had no legal precedent. We had no policy. We had no governance. And we really didn't even have a coordinated effort between the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, the State Department, or any of the policymakers. So I do believe I learned quite a bit about the mission of cyber at its inception. And I'm proud to say I was part of the group that ended up standing up U.S. Cyber Command in my last 3 years in the military.
Wow.
Now I formed IP3, as you mentioned, in 2016. My focus there is to develop civil nuclear power to compete against Russia and China on the global stage.
Pretty impressive, Mike. So, with IP3's focus on nuclear energy, I assume you are developing public-private partnerships where you have boards, etc. So, how do you deal with cyber threats that are so prevalent, especially in that industry? And how do you address the general lack of cyber expertise on a lot of those boards and in the C-suite?
Well, obviously, nuclear power is an incredibly critical industry to be protected both from kinetic and non-kinetic threats. And I would say that we've done a very good job inside the fence line of protecting nuclear power plants. Outside the fence line, we have not done as well a job as we should have. And of course, at the time, cyber security was an afterthought in the development of mega projects. Now, I'm happy to say it's one of the first things that comes up in the boardroom on a mega project, particularly the ones that we do, where we're developing civil nuclear power married up with data centers and then distributing that data to a host of clients. So, as you can imagine, it opens up all kinds of cyber threats. So, I think the good news is the discussion's no longer an afterthought or one that the CISO is trying to lead. It is coming from the board level now and is one of the first things we talk about in our industry, particularly internationally. How are you going to protect this critical infrastructure from cyber threats? Because the very thing we're delivering, AI, is so critical in that mission space. And as you can imagine, it is very vulnerable to future cyber threats as well.
Right. So, Mike, with all of those discussions that you guys are now having in the beginnings, but the timelines are so compressed. You have this large construction project, large infrastructure project, things in the IT, AI, quantum's on the cusp, all of these things moving. What's the what's the impact to those discussions of those timelines? How do you guys deal with that need to compress, or are there certain things that you recommend that they do as part of those discussions that they're having early, given that timeline's just going to come so quickly towards them?
The good news is, at least from the military IC perspective, everyone realizes the importance of cybersecurity. So we're not pushing on a closed door. The challenge we run into is oftentimes these mega projects, and that's really what we're talking about
Hmm.
around real estate, data center development, nuclear development, how that compute is going to be developed, protected, distributed. And we're becoming a military that is more and more dependent upon data than any other resource, including fuel. I look at AI as the fuel of the military very shortly, and we're trying to get there very quickly. Now, the challenge with that is what kind of cyber threats are presented when you become so dependent upon AI to run your operations. There are two things that I think the military is waking up to. AI, or compute at the edge, requires an enormous amount of power. And as we shift away from encrypted systems that run on civilian backbone to on-prem systems that are built with resilience in mind, that is going to, again, completely change the cyber landscape. One of the things we do on our projects is we bring in project experts that know how to do owner integration across these domains, because left to its own, it's very stovepiped between the grid side of the business, the compute side of the business, the nuclear side of the business, the off-taker side of the business, and none of them are going to talk to each other very effectively. So you have to have an integrator inside of the system that's always asking about what is our resilience plan around the cyber threat.
Yeah.
So, Mike, obviously, Ukraine has been in the news today and a lot recently, and you've done significant work in Ukraine and the Middle East. And both areas have cybersecurity concerns as one of their top priorities and risks. So, how do you advise companies that are potentially moving more directly into those regions about the risk and concerns around cyber espionage?
Well, I think the first thing I would say about Ukraine is it is the 21st century battlefield of cyber.
Yeah.
So if you're in Ukraine or you're working in Ukraine and you're watching how the Ukrainians are dealing with the cyber threat from Russia, you are getting firsthand knowledge in the future of cyber warfare. You've seen the Ukrainians brilliantly manage this shift towards autonomous systems, towards unmanned systems, using AI as a key tool in their fight against the Russians. So Ukraine is a very complex environment, but one of the things I would take away from that war in Ukraine, when it hopefully ends and ceases very soon, is fighting the fight with cyber is completely different than it was even just 2 or 3 years ago. So you're going to take a lot of lessons learned out of Ukraine about how to operate in denied environments, how to operate in electromagnetic warfare, heavily induced environments. It again is going to completely change how we think about protecting our resources in cyberspace.
Yeah, we've also, in some of the partners and folks that we've dealt with and or partnering with in Ukraine, it is amazing to us how they are so, as you said, integrated with the warfare and the cyber in everything. And they really have a jump on a lot of people's thinking, and they are a great example to use and to look to.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I've taken away from my time in Ukraine, it's a country that very much is an engineer's country. They are at the top of any conversation around AI, and this was before the war.
Before.
Many of the most important US technology companies that were getting more and more into AI actually went to Ukraine to hire up all the top engineers.
Wow.
Because they were absolutely ahead of their time when it came to developing AI systems. The other thing the Ukrainians do that we need to all take a lesson from is detailed measures of effectiveness. They very much study the problem all the time and figure out where the vulnerabilities are. And they're able to identify not just the success of every sortie they accomplish, but where were the vulnerabilities? And they have actually uncovered several Russian sabotage efforts in cyber because they're so detailed in measuring the effectiveness of every mission that they operate. So in their culture, in their DNA, is to understand both the threats and the value of AI, which is something that we'll all learn a great deal from.
So, we've been thinking a lot about quantum computing and AI, obviously. And so how do you think about that, including encryption and what encryption is today and what's going to happen with encryption in the future? How do you think about that in the world of cyber?
I think you're seeing a transition back to recognizing that quantum will change our ability to operate encrypted systems in the traditional form that we have today. And you're seeing more and more of the military requirements being driven by operating in more denied environments. And this is even in the United States. I'll give you a great example. The US Navy just put out an RFI talking about powering their military bases with nuclear power. And in that RFI, it said you have to be able to operate without any grid power whatsoever. So they're really pushing the services to recognize not just the threat of China being in our infrastructure, but the fact is you may have to operate without the benefit of utility-based power. That is an enormous requirement that is being levied on the military. At the same time, recognizing that AI is very power hungry. So even if you had stable power to operate today's mission, you're nowhere near the amount of compute or electrical power that you need at the edge. So you're going to start to hear more and more of these conversations, whether they're driven by Golden Dome or they're driven by the concerns of the threats from China, or just the inculcation of AI into our warfighting business. A tremendous amount of electricity is needed to do that, and also compute at the edge. So you're going to see more and more of these deployable power offtake models being driven. And I believe nuclear power is going to be the source of that energy for the military, for critical infrastructure, for smart cities. And you certainly see our allies moving in that direction already.
Yeah, quantum, what's your timeline? Everybody has a different view of the timeline of quantum. I'm more in the camp of probably sooner than what we think, because even how AI is being used, that the acceleration on that has just been tremendous. Where do you sit on the timeline of when quantum do you think will be here in a way that's meaningful?
I'm probably closer to where you are, Catherine. I think that in some cases there's some cognitive dissonance around the timeline to quantum, partially because we built most of our infrastructure believing quantum was always going to be 10 or 20 years away. And now with AI in particular, that will accelerate the timeline to quantum. So I think this decade, we're going to see the first real instantiation of a true quantum system that will then threaten our traditional IT security infrastructure.
Well, Mike, I really can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. I know you've had lots of tugs on your time with Fox News appearances and other news appearances and everything. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I mean, this has been a really informative discussion, and we appreciate you appearing on our podcast. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to our Cyber Straight Talk podcast. If you would like more information about Cyber Knowledge Partners or to subscribe to our podcasts or newsletters, please go to our website at cybernowledgepartners.com. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to our next podcast that we can meet with you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, guys.